I think last time in the little like intro we were talking about like Al Caminos and stuff. So now we're talking about like the freezing point of gas is probably a good little transition there.
Can a Camino survive?
Yeah, would an El Camino survive in sub-zero temperatures?
Sounds like a good research question. You can probably get some funding behind that. Sure, Chevy would want to know like what part, like a little like like stress test, like gaskets and all that stuff. Like I'm sure there's some science to that.
Like, everybody's bringing back cars from the past. Where's the El Camino at? Where's the 2023 edition of the El Camino?
Well, don't say that too loud, because I think last time we were talking about, what is it, the Chevy SS, that little like Herman Monster thing?
Yeah.
We need guardrails. Like, we want it in its prime, not like your futuristic spin on George Jetson's El Camino.
Look at the Bronco. They're encouraging people. They're offering people money to not buy a Bronco. They're like, they have such a demand for Broncos from Ford right now.
Oh.
Like, think about that, but with the El Camino. Like, Chevy could have the same problem with the El Camino. Bring it back. Get that hype train going.
Yeah. In that sentence, they is Ford. Like, they're paying you not to... Mm-hmm. Where do you sign up for that? I would drive a Bronco, but like I'll take. Or do you have to like buy another Ford and say that I wanted a Bronco, but like I didn't?
Yes.
Okay.
So they'll like apply credit. So like, I don't know, if the one article is like 2,500 or something like that to like choose a different vehicle from like Ford. So like you're at the dealership, you want a Bronco, they'll be like, hey, we'll give you a credit if you go buy something else just because they.
I wonder if they like profile you and you're like, oh, you're a Bronco person. Like you're versus like, nah, like you're thrifty and you're just smart. Yeah. Like go get your Focus. Good luck.
You're an El Camino person.
It's like a sorting hat, like the El Camino.
We know your type.
Going to Hogwarts and they drop a hat on that tells you what car you're gonna get. Like, oh, you're a Chevy person now. Sorry. Like, oh, like Toyotas. Here you go. That would be awesome.
When I was Googling mugs and El Camino shirts and mugs this morning, I forgot there was an El Camino Breaking Bad Netflix movie or something with Aaron Paul. I don't know if you knew that, but that was new to me.
That might be new to a lot of people. That sounds...
I don't know if it's still out. Netflix. Yep. Still there. A Breaking Bad movie.
2019.
Yes.
Okay.
El Camino, a Breaking Bad movie. I actually think I forgot to watch this when it came out.
El Camino up.
Do you guys want to play Price is Right for its box office? Like I guess that's net income, hopefully.
Okay.
So the budget, for context, the budget was $6 million.
Okay, I'm gonna go 28 million.
I'll say 3 million.
Okay.
We go low.
Bob Barker would have had one of his infamous moments here. $1 would have been the right bet. I must have been because of COVID or something, but 40K is what Wikipedia says, which sounds like that doesn't sound right, but also it's like an amazing trivia fact that this movie got 40K in the box office. Unless there's
especially because it's like the #1 TV series of all time.
Yeah, something seems funky about that. Now I'm invested.
We'll give everybody an extra minute then, because everyone's flooding in right now.
I mean, it got 4 wins and 24 nominations.
I see. It was a limited theatrical release. It was only in it was only screened in 12 or I think they offered it to 125 theaters, 12 streamed it, and they all made $3 or $4 grand each.
That makes sense because it was a Netflix thing, so I was wondering how that works out for the calculation, but if they only did a limited theatrical release, that jives.
But also, if I was on the staff, it's hey, don't index that in Wikipedia. That makes us look weird. That's not a fair, we didn't win, we didn't lose. It's kind of evals and scores and stuff. It's a completely different topic, but hey,
aligns.
Same.
You got to bring all roads lead back to evals. You got to like,
Yep.
I guess that's
all
the
tied
key
together.
to, yeah, the key to like sales and marketing is just like topic convergence.
All right. That's why
Yes.
music down.
All right. We'll kick it. Thank you.
Kick it.
Cool. Well, this is part 2. Where's our picks? There we are. All right. So yeah, thank you again for joining, Jamie.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, I got coffee this time, so I might be a little bit more talkative, but yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. We all got coffee. That's great. We're just gonna survive. Yeah, so we're back. This is just part 2 of our APT29 emulations. Yeah, I think Paul, you're gonna kind of like lead the way here on where we left off. I think it was somewhere around credential access or persistence.
Yeah, so we'll kind of skip into like section 2, but there was a lot of great feedback from the last discussion we had on part 1 about the setup of micro emulation plans, kind of the history and some of the things about it, which was really well received. And I think it's a great topic. And so excited to come back and kind of wrap this up with the actual hands-on aspect of it. I just kind of touch on different components, right? For those that may not have seen it yet, right? Talking about that the concept was not like all of the aspect of the emulation, but like really interesting components that comprise it that you can go kind of test and provide the validation aspect. Cam, you want to kind of like recap that aspect of like what the micro emulation aspect was?
I think you're spot on there where, a lot of the evaluation or the emulation work at MITRE started with attack evaluation. So we were trying to build out these like full scenarios, I think the idiom's, what is it, like soup to nuts, which like the other day someone explained that to me. I'm like, oh, it's dining. Like I thought it was like you're like harvesting soup and turning into nuts. I'm like, that's completely doesn't make any sense. But okay, I guess people eat nuts at the end of dinner, whatever. But we built out these full scenarios where it was like initial access all the way to whatever the exfiltration, or in this case, we had a couple emulation plans that like were more ransomware oriented, so that was kind of cool. But what we kind of realized, even looking at the evaluation results, was like you kind of have to zoom in. You have to pick your battles. You can't defend every point across every campaign. You can't defend 700 some odd techniques. There's going to be little, zoomed in focus, like I'll keep calling them knuckles. I don't know if that actually kind of makes sense, but I like the word knuckles. It's little knuckles where you're like, okay, like here's weird combinations of techniques that I'm really good at defending. Or I'm like, based on our tools and based on our processes, based on our staff, like we have AV. So like files being dropped to disk is like a really good signal for us. Or we have process telemetry. So, when one process spawns like a bunch of children and they all look like CMD waxy, like that's a really good signal for us. Versus trying to, think you need to like hit every point. So that was kind of the premise of micro emulations, was even looking at our own stuff. How can we kind of, get to those knuckles of best defense, but also make it like similar to atomic testing, trivial to execute, where you don't need to be a red teamer. You don't need to have some full-fledged C2 and a day to do infrastructure and all the setup. You can kind of just download, double click, and get the telemetry that you need in order to kind of test your defenses. So that was the kind of abstraction we were playing with. There's some other stuff that, part 1, I think we dove into this a little bit better, but like, obviously we tried to also like, document these, recognizing that, myself included, I don't have all the time in the world. I know a lot of people out there doing like really awesome emulation stuff. Sometimes my only foot in the door is just reading it. Like I don't have time to set it up. I don't have time to execute it. I don't have, shiny object things are going by, but we also wanted to make these in a way that you could really just like read the emulation plan, take a look at it, like, hey, like, this plan is double clicking, we'll say like, it's executing a Word doc that has malicious macros. Like we all kind of can conceptualize that. Some of us can maybe tabletop that to like, oh, this is the defenses for that. Some of us can't, or we don't know. So, it's there. If you want to download it and execute it, you can. But we also kind of documented, well, here's what a demo looks like. If you kind of just want to watch it, here's what our defensive lessons learned in terms of detection and mitigation. So really kind of rolling that up and, to be completely honest, stealing ideas from attack where, myself included, like I've never executed most of the techniques in attack, but I feel like in a lot of ways, like I feel somewhat intimately connected to a lot of them because you can kind of just read it and you're like, oh, cool. Like here's how Actor X did it. Here's how Malware Y did it. here's a description of it. Here's how we would defend it. Here's how we'd mitigate it. Like, I don't really need to, I mean, maybe at some point I want to validate something. I want to tune something. Maybe I can go a little further, but I've at least, at least from a decision-making standpoint, I have a good grasp of that, enough to kind of work on that knowledge. So that was really that kind of, it's not like we created some new magical unicorn thing that didn't exist. Like, this is pretty much, I think a lot of people are already kind of in this space. We were just really excited to kind of, more than anything, like create a prototype and like a framework where, even now, we had a meeting earlier today, like we're still building these out, because it's like, hey, this structure, this works. It's like something we can put together in 2 weeks versus 2 months. And, we're getting more and more comfortable with the idea and kind of the structure of these. So a little bit of a brain vomit there, induced by yours truly. But yeah, it was definitely just a fun, exciting new adventure for us.
Random question, this may be a little out of the scope, but did MITRE defend, did that, I think I saw that recently where it came up. Did that come out of any of this, or was it have any crossover or anything?
So this is always fun because I get to work the booth at like RSA for MITRE. Like, everyone comes and they're like, oh, like all this stuff must be connected, right? It's like, absolutely not. So I know Peter, like we're obviously colleagues, but you'd be surprised how many different things are happening like behind like the veil of MITRE, that have really no connection. And I think Defend is a good example of that. And we even have like, we don't want to be like the framework knowledge base people, but we have like Defend and Engage and Atlas and all these different frameworks and things going on. We ourselves sometimes kind of lose track, but short answer to that would be no. But I do think there's some, from what I understand Defend is trying to do, there's obviously some overlap there, but they're not necessarily like interwoven. Like even this and Attack, it really isn't kind of interconnected in any meaningful way, besides like I kind of take hats off and jump back and forth. So it's like the same people doing the same stuff, but like there is really no formal kind of like systematic programmatic glue that keeps them together, besides like, hey, common language, Attack. It's really easy to explain stuff using these magical little TIDs.
Yep. It reminds me of CAR. We worked with the MITRE CAR group, and that was completely separate.
It's all, I think we had a pretty iconic tweet a couple months ago now that was like the little like twister. Remember the little wheel you spin it?
Yeah.
It was like all these little like, right hand on, red, left foot on yellow. And it was like all these little like MITRE programs and frameworks. And you're like, it's just kind of, for better or worse, that's what we're up to now.
That's awesome.
Cool. So yeah, thanks for recapping that, especially for people that may not have seen or may have already forgotten what we talked about on part one, but always good to just kind of refresh it. So yeah,
we do have the recording. It's on the YouTubes, and then we also have the actual demo broken out as well. So
right on.
Made it easy.
Let's jump into it. I think we'll kind of just pick up a little bit where we left off. There'll be some slight overlap, but go straight into it. And so pretty much now we're just going to run into some tests. And some are actually pretty interesting. In thinking about how loud some of these potentially are, of like what's actually happening, right? And everybody thinks like APT, super evasive, like, but between the two scenarios, which we touched on last time, like one's very smash and grab, like in and out, very loud, like here we are. And the other one's a little bit more stealthy, low and slow, and more optics. But I think there might be some confusion sometimes that because APT gets thrown around, we think like super tactical, not going to see them. They leave like a single, little dropping somewhere, and like that's the only thing, but that's not always the case. So like how does that kind of factor in as we're kind of running through these tests? Like what should people think about in terms of an APT and what's actually visible?
That's actually, I love that point. And that was like one of the premises of like those knuckles we were talking about, where exactly your point, like, sophisticated nation state actors, crimeware skids, they drop files of disk, they use PowerShell, they might even all CMD WAC-C. Like if you can kind of figure out like what you're good at and find those points, you don't really need, ideally you're still getting better. You're trying to understand your detection engineering, but you're not kind of like completely SOL if like you're not hooking every API and like doing all this like super fancy stuff. That's super. that was like one of our realizations too. Is just like, looking at like, hordes and hordes of eval data. It's like, what do you actually do with this? And it's like, yeah, like you're never this whole like idea of like 100%. I always say 100% attack coverage, but I see it like very often like 100% miter coverage, which to your point, Mike, is like hilarious. It's like, mapping to the miter, covering the miter, but that's just like not a thing, and it's not even a thing you want, because like imagine like even from a detection perspective, if you were actually like alerting and sensing all that stuff, like the amount of false positives you're going to deal with, like imagine like sitting as a SOC analyst and it's like, hey, you have a true positive, like do you want like, what is your kind of perspective here? Like, do you want like a lot of high fidelity true positives, or would you want like 10,000 alerts about the exact same, like, oh, like we got every aspect of this one true positive, and like now I have this, like, I mean, that's good, that's really good for like IR and things like that, but in terms of like immediate response, that might be a bit overwhelming in terms of just like, hey, like let's focus on key knuckles where like tripwires effectively versus like, I don't really, especially from like a response and remediation, I might not need like every little detail broken out. Like I forgot what someone said the other day. It's like, hey, like when you're in like someone's like attacking you, you don't really need all that much information versus like I just need to self-preserve and then figure out like all the rest of that later.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think we were having a conversation about that yesterday at Splunk, where we ship a lot of content that might be set to notable for enterprise security, or the security like semi product we have. And they're set to notable. And when you go to look at your notables after like an attack or something, right? And it just floods, especially if it's lateral movement. There's 25 machines with WMIC, and all this stuff going crazy. And we were talking about how like the correlation side of things, or RBA and things like that, having better analytics for RBA just to generate risk based on things, and then have something that kind of sweeps across the top, the correlation piece of it, to kind of bring that up to the analyst view instead of 5,000 alerts. I think it's a problem with almost every product though, because I remember one time we had this was years ago at one of my last companies, we had an Xpero outbreak with malware, and it embedded itself in like the first couple bytes of a header of every binary, every file, and it just infected the whole environment. And AV was triggering over and over and over. And it was just like, is everything bad? Like, is there malware everywhere in my organization? And they were like, our domain controller is, blowing up and everything from this now, every file is being quarantined, right? And so it's like, it's kind of the same deal, Could you imagine? Yeah.
And that's like such a fascinating like thread, because like even from like obviously from like the technology and sensor standpoint, like if you buy EDR, you should probably tune it because your environment's like probably super weird. Like no developer ever predicted what they would see like when their agent was on your host. But also to your point, like that like scoring, prioritization, risk calculation, like people really like have, even to us, like from the attack side, like pushed us like, hey, like could you tell us like what's the most important tactics, what's the most important techniques? And honestly, like you said, like it depends. Like it's such a weird, like it's such a important, critical problem that no one can answer besides, it's like in the eye of the beholder. So it's like, what do you like? It's like one of those things. Like I wish we could do something, but it's like all I can really do is just brain vomit about like how you would potentially do that. But at the same time, it's like there's just so much nuance there. It's like, what do you, especially like from your perspective, it's like, how do you bake that into something that's scalable and not just complete like armchair hand wave, like 7 versus 3? And you're like, what's the 7 versus a 3? It's
yeah, exactly. I actually, random, before Paul gets started here, I ran across another MITRE project where like, pretty sure it was MITRE, and it was like you click through like different things to see like where to prioritize.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah, it was like the technique calculator. So that was like so we talked about that MITRE Veil. We also have like MITRE Ingenuity, which is like a public facing research arm of like MITRE. So like Yeah, that was like one of their things was like they did like another take at like sightings where they were trying to collect a bunch of information and tell you like, okay, here's the top techniques that we saw. That was really neat. And they built like a calculator. It was like, hey, if you have like process data or like network data or both, or like low confidence in your ability to do X, Y, Z, if you like these control standards, like here's like a starting point in terms of like what your top 10 techniques should be. And again, that was one of those, I was really glad that they put it into a calculator because it's like it is very, and like even those questions I think could be extended, but it's like at least that's like a starting point, but there's still like just so much like nuance. So I think like I'm stoked that that's like a step in the right direction, and I'm curious to see if like I think I've seen a couple blogs where people like did that kind of stuff as like a purple team, like, hey, we sat down with a client, we did the little calculator thing, and then like we figured out like here's what we need to start in terms of purple team. I think those use cases make a lot of sense, but to be completely honest, I don't think like you'll ever get to the point where you just like chisel it in stone, like this is our threat model, this is like where we are, because that's just, I mean, just given the nature of everything, there's so much fluidity there that's just not a good look.
Yeah, I thought that was neat.
So Paul, did that I remember last time we were hung up on that what is it, the exfil, the smash and grab. Did that ever finish, or did you have to like punt it?
No, that's somewhere. We're gonna skip that part just because I think I cleaned up all the files in the downloads, and it took everything. I had like clones of repos of tools that were, I think that thing wound up being like 8 gigs, but it was still effective and worked. No, so so following along and you have the repo open, and touching last time, we convert, instead of using Puppy because I could not get Puppy to actually run in 90 capacity, I pivoted to Covenant and just tweaked some things around that still achieve the same result. So we're going to skip to section 3. Actually, just kidding. Section 4, excuse me. So for the first 2 sections, section 1 is really just executing the initial payload, getting that going. And then section 2 is that what Jamie was just alluding to, which was the exfil component, which basically is a PowerShell one-liner that goes through the user's different directories and looks for specific file extensions, grabs those, compresses those to into a zip folder called drafts.zip in the app data folder of the current user that's running the payload. And then there was just a simple command to retrieve that zip file. And then the next part, step 3, was to deploy the stealth toolkit. So this is where we're kind of jumping into, which was we spun up our interpreter handler. In this case, there would be a PNG that is encoded with the PowerShell. We tweaked that because we couldn't get it going. But the idea would be to upload something to the downloads folder of the current user that we're executing as. Then there's a UAC bypass, which was actually a very interesting one, which we touched on last time, to basically create a bunch of registry keys, delegate execution, and use SDCLT, which is part of the control panel for managing backups internally. And then once you create those registry keys and then tell it what to go execute, so in the emulation plan, it tells us to go execute, the PNG, which will have the encoded PowerShell to call back and create the session to Meterpreter, to Metasploit, and then go from there. And then SDLC, and then it gets an elevated command prompt. So instead of running as a medium integrity process, now it's running as a high integrity process. So I skipped that part and basically just executed the Meterpreter PS1 as an admin. So we're right at step 4. So on the screen, all I did so far was upload the command. As you can see, I don't know how to enter the session currently. So I entered the session, or pointed to the right folder of where it exists, and then uploaded it. And then I just jumped into, which would be step 4.a. So now we're just going to extrapolate the zip folder using PowerShell. So this is like an interactive PowerShell session. So we'll copy it, expand it out, and then the next one will to copy the exported directory of this zip file, which has a bunch of utilities in it, and then we'll copy it over to C program data into quote unquote sysinternals, and then things are going to get spicy.
So speaking of like weird chat GPT use cases, I think that'd be a pretty sweet one of like checking all your like red team like inputs and like, oh, like I see you're doing upload blah blah blah, like you meant to do this, and like a little like hook there. That'd be kind of sweet.
That should be integrated with Meterpreter.
Yeah.
Quick fix on the fly. I see you're trying to use delete. Would you like to upload ransomware.exe?
Maybe you shouldn't name your payload evil.exe. Man, it's just random characters.
Yeah.
Okay, so in going into 4B now, so now that we're inside of the sysinternal suite directory and C program data, the next couple steps are to clean up the initial payload, which would have been in Puppy or in our case Covenant. Because that process no longer exists, we're going to kind of skip that. All it would do is you would run git process from PowerShell and then grab the process ID of that particular thing, terminate it, and then go on to the next one. So now that we're in, now we're kind of just stepping through into the next part, which is GCI. It's going to get child item of the desktop. I don't know what's on here. Actually, I think Metasploit might be in there. Yep. Or excuse me, Mimikatz. Chainsaw doing some testing. Yeah. There's our initial payload that we would have clicked. As you can see, because the awesome right to left override, we get some sweet characters that are just unknown. Oh, don't do that.
Okay, taking a turn. Yeah, this day is getting a little spicier than expected. Yeah, it's awesome.
So delete. I've not actually used this binary from sysinternals, but I presume it's just going to delete and shred the file.
One would hope. Yeah, it's. I think everything in there in that zip was either like doctored from us, like you said before, like the text file that had like the malicious PowerShell at the bottom, and I think that delete should be like the signed one, but I guess we'll see.
Oh, because it doesn't like that file doesn't exist. Okay. All right, we can fix this. Let's see.
Let's do it live.
Again, because of the right. Let's see.
You missing a dot?
Oh, I'm missing a whole bunch of stuff.
Also, like it was super fascinating. I forgot if we got this from CTI or not, but that accept user end user agreement, like that was actually a really fascinating flag for the command, because apparently I didn't realize like those like acceptances are stored in the registry for sysinternals. So like a slick detection was like watching for the creation or population or modification any whit thereof of that like registry key, and you could kind of pick up like, oh crap, like why is delete running on this host? Yeah, we don't really have a cheap out for the PID trick on this one. I don't. Yeah.
Okay, I don't know how to copy paste, so we'll go to the next one.
Yeah.
I believe this basically just going to delete the payload right off the desktop. The next one will go and delete the zip file that was done earlier. I think that still exists. One file deleted. So when I think about trying to leave less of an imprint, right? If you think about what happened here, we uploaded an entire zip folder which had a whole bunch of tools in it, right? So there's, in our case, there's going to be ps-exec, sdelete, just run ls on it and kind of show what's actually in there. Access check, host. So then there's 3 txt files, which are actually not txt files, which are actually PowerShell scripts. But why, I guess, like, why would I want to potentially be like, hey, here's a bunch of random binaries that may not be on disk or not utilized in the environment? In the case of like an sdelete versus using something like the rm command, right? Like, why wouldn't I use something that's potentially built in versus bringing something else?
In this case, this is kind of armchair quarterback, like why never? Because like half the time we do these same things. We sit and look at like adversary tradecraft. Like why would you like export or type the output of commands like a text file? Like that seems silly. I think it's based on resiliency, and in this case, like they're more like, hey, like detecting like sdelete running on disk is probably like pretty easy for like an advanced detection engineer. But that said, like we're buying a lot of, I'm saying we is like the collective like APT29, but they're buying a lot of like time, but like, hey, like, you know, it's gonna be super annoying for IR. Like they're gonna see that file creation and then they're gonna have to like dig through like, you know, file records and, you know, try to figure out like, because I mean, effectively SLE is doing like a pretty thorough shred. I think what it does, it like renames the file, overwrites it with like every character of the alphabet, and then like basically churns that over and over again. So it's, I don't think it's a detection evasion versus just like a forensic kind of buy yourself a little bit of time before you figure out what's happening. And like, and again, I think most actors aren't like, this is, you know, insurmountable tradecraft that'll never be caught. They're really just playing with those kind of mean time to response, mean time to identification factors. So I think in that case, like it's, hey, it's a signed Microsoft binary. It's AV probably isn't going to get super annoyed with it. And then it probably adds a little bit of a, it's kind of like the reverse pyramid of pain, adding like a little imposing cost on your defenders and just saying, hey, this is going to get us enough time to get out of this environment. And then probably at that point, I mean, for all intents and purposes, they might not care. Like, hey, we got our objectives, we got what we wanted, you know, indict us. So cool. Like we're the Russian government. Great.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's interesting behavior because I remember back in, if you remember the early days of EDR tools like with carbon black response and stuff like that coming around, becoming popular within organizations, but very early. At the time, it was like Mandiant Mirror and like RSA had like their, I can't remember what it's called. I want to call it like RSA Wildcat, but I don't think it was that or something. But it was, they were very forensic focused, right? And so like, I feel like S-Delete and things like that really kind of burned like those files so that that practitioner on the other end using like Mandiant Mirror can't pull those type of files back anymore. It really wrecks that like old school, you know, forensic type of like digging in type stuff. It's interesting.
I was like purely curious. I know we evaluated them. It was NetWitness, I think was the,
okay.
Yeah.
That somebody had a cat one. Maybe I just like cats. I don't know.
EDR cats. That's actually a really pretty sweet name. Kitty cats. Yeah.
Thundercats.
And I think even at the time, this was wild. To your point, this was wild tradecraft too, where it's like, hey, like you could literally just like I mean, we were kind of fascinated with like the choice of PowerShell as like tradecraft, but at the time, like there was no script block logging. It was kind of one of those just like, hey, like it's not going to spawn necessarily a bunch of processes. It's pretty clean from the process tree, but also to your point, like you're not dropping compiled binaries to disk. You can drop literally a text file, rename it. It's still being treated as text. And then, you know, in this case, we have like basically a full-fledged interpreter running that's kind of in a lot of environments really not being, you know, actually paid attention to.
Yeah. And yeah, like at the time you would have to run a sweep nightly looking for interesting artifacts, you know, and you wouldn't want to run it daily because it's Yara, you know, or any other type of, it's just like, or every hour or something, you know, people would start getting mad, but it's.
Then you S-delete this, you know, text file and who knows what happened. It's kind of, that's where you get that full disk image and you start really cracking this open.
Well, what's interesting though is like when you're thinking about EDR, not all of them will tell you the file type, right? Even though the extension is .txt and there's like an assumption that, okay, this is the file as written, they don't necessarily give you the magic bytes and actually validate what that is. Now, in the case of like this particular one, it is. But if you open it and you just scroll down just a little bit more than normal, you'll see the massive amount of PowerShell that goes on, right? And in the three, so in the first one that we just converted, so .readme, so in the resources folder in the repo that we linked for where the emulation plan lives, you can just pop that open and you're like, oh yeah, cool. It's the readme from sysinternals that like when you just download sysinternals, tells you about the tools. But then you keep scrolling and there's like another 800 lines of PowerShell code. But that's hard to discern because it's technically not just like a PowerShell script or like, you know, it's not just an exe with the standard magic binaries that we're all accustomed to seeing. So it makes it interesting from that perspective of you're not just going to you're gonna have to do more analysis than just trusting the extension, or even if it does provide you the magic plates, like it may not be exactly that.
I think overall, like I was on evals for like 4 years. I think that's a good summation of like my biggest takeaway was I went into it and I was like, oh, we're doing these evaluations, EDR, these magical products that are like security and like going to catch everything we do. Like, really, I mean, like, no shade. It's software. Like, there are like optimizations, there's limitations. They can't scan every file. Like, well, I'm gonna keep using it, soup to nuts. It's not realistic. So like, there's gonna be like, and that was, I think, was part of the process of like, we did the results, we did all this stuff, but like even just finding those and fixing those, because like there was some things where it was like, hey, like we'll scan the first 10 bytes, to your point, like we're gonna scan the first 10 bytes of every file and kind of guess, or we'll scan, basically put them in an array, and if it seems redundant, we'll do the first one. And you're like, oh, like there's a bunch of text files on here, and like, adversaries learn that kind of stuff, and they're like, oh, cool, like exactly to your point, why would you drop this stuff to disk? If you drop 10 binaries that are all Microsoft signed and then hide like mimikatz.exe, there's a chance, like optimization software wise, that 10th binary might not be scanned. So like it's all kind of a game of, just finding those edge cases, finding those what ifs. And to your point, like it's not, I don't think adversaries need to, nor even strive to just be these invisible, like, you'll never see me. It's really, and that's something that we've learned through attack is you'll see all this tradecraft being introduced and all these like slick ideas. Like, adversaries are still, in a lot of cases, looking for the path of least resistance. And that might not be the most sophisticated thing. It's like, we've CMD whack C into a text file because it works. And we're going to stop doing that if you ever stop us. But I keep like sympathizing, but they'll keep doing that until we stop them. But until like that's a reality, like it's stable, it works. Like, why would they do anything else?
Yep.
You go look at DEFA reports, which are phenomenal. You look at some of this and you're like, it's loud, it's noisy. I should see all of this and even prevent it in most cases. So it's really interesting that, from your perspective, that it's loud and in your face, and you're like, this is an APT, but it works, right? Like, if it works, why change it? And until it stops working, they're going to keep doing it. So, and we can put all the detections in the world, but I think at some point, like, prevention has to become a core component, especially on some of these like quick wins. Is going to be kind of the key.
This persistence payload was like super cool because at the time, like we were super like, we didn't know much about like token manipulation and process trees. So this first persistence is like, I believe it's a service. So what that binary does, it's actually, we didn't understand why I did this at the time, but until we had to recreate it, it grabs the token of Explorer and then basically does like a proxy, like, spawn child as like, kind of rebuilds the process tree. And we kind of looked at that. We're like, why the hell would you do that? It seems kind of silly. But basically the idea was like injecting, like, again, like I think one of the key like tenets of like APT29 was like they develop and they operate in a way that shows like they know how defenders, like they know what EDR tools look like. They know how defenders work. Like they're doing S-delete to counter like forensic kind of IR. In this case, they're rebuilding process trees to not necessarily be like foolproof, but like, hey, if you were in a SOC and you were on your 12th hour shift and like your 10th cup of coffee, you would look at that and say like, well, why is Java spawning from Explorer? Like, again, like threat scoring, like 2, whatever, like I don't care. And then you'd move on, and then later on you'd be like, oh crap, like that was a beacon, that was some kind of like payload. But at least like it was fascinating how they were like kind of like almost reverse engineering blue team SOC defenders and like sprinkling that into their tradecraft. And again, it's not like the most sophisticated stuff ever. Oh yeah, you pulled it. Is this source? Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the first one, which we ran earlier, was invoke discovery. So basically just getting some basic information of the user as well as some environmental things from like what AV is installed, like what's the security product. In our case, it's just default Defender, which has been disabled. But then kind of going into your first part, which was invoke persistence step 1. So within it, there's a Java empty sub file that gets copied over to System32, and that creates the service, which is just a interpreter service binary. For those that may not be familiar, a traditional binary and a service binary are actually constructed differently. There's some initialization that happens in the header of the regular binary or of a service binary that isn't in a traditional. So you can't just take like calculator, put as a service, and then pop calculator as system from a service, right? It doesn't work like that. So services technically can't be GUI, as well as another thing. So you can't just like run Office as, like Microsoft Word as system and trick somebody into opening it as system, and then your malicious macro runs and dumps LSAS and posts it back via VBA, which, trust me, I looked into. But it's kind of super interesting that it's again just a standard service, and it has some slick PowerShell that again is straight from Meterpreter and kind of goes back into it. So that's persistent step one.
I love the little like light touch of in like the service like description, putting a little trademark. It's like the little things, right? Like if you were doing like looking at auto runs, you're like, oh, like Java trademark, like that looks like legitimate. Yeah, it's more real.
And look at files system, right? So if you're thinking about like okay, going through like interesting processes, writing files to disk, but not just writing them, like where are they writing them? Like why is this binary that's executing out of downloads writing something to C Windows System 32? That's kind of interesting. Obviously, you have things like installers that may occur, but if you're thinking that this is suspicious already and worth investigating, like there's something else, and then all of a sudden it creates a sketchy service. So there's a lot of different things that we can look into, but
this is an interesting moment too, because like those are two different persistence options. Like if you were doing like analysis of a box, like unless you saw this script, like you might not associate these two as like coming from the same source. So like the Java MT sup, it's like, oh, it could be real. And then there's this other like huge red herring where it's like, oh, like giant like Meterpreter PowerShell blob in like a registry key. And like you would freak out and spend all day and like write your report and like, oh, like I got them. And then you're like, oh crap, like there was more. So like little stuff like that, it's always like fascinating. And like I imagine like we're almost like reverse engineering their like dev cycle and just kind of like getting in their brain, which is again, like I think to the point. There's a couple times I felt like we had like Stockholm syndrome where like I get it, like their operations make so much sense to me, and like I'm not a fan, but like this is really cool. But yeah, like just like little nuances like that where you're kind of like why would it's coming from the same actor, and like that doesn't look like the same level of tradecraft, where like one of these is like grotesque and like to your point loud and annoying, but like it could intentionally be like just this like, hey, go chase the golden snitch while we actually like operate over here.
Yeah, that's super interesting, right? Because you look at this kind of first one, which is this is switch one. So when you run the command, it's invoke persistence and then give it the value of 1. And this is the first one. So basically, it's going to copy over the Meterpreter Java service binary to System32, and then create service via PowerShell. So new service, hack name, give the binary path and the display name, and then the startup type. But now step 2 is a little bit louder and a lot crazier than just a couple small things. It gets pretty heavy. So this output, if you're running, again, the straight resources straight out of the already precompiled, like this PowerShell basic support blob's already in there. This is tweaked because we had to modify due to internal for the home lab IP spacing. But it would already be there. So in this case, you can kind of see the internal IP address and port and setup. Then it goes through a whole bunch of stuff to create the registry keys, set some paths of what's occurring. There's some more binaries that are actually moved and then changed. So specifically 2 of them. One is string 64 being moved to System32 as host UI, and then the other one is host UI.txt to host UI bat. What are those, Jamie?
Okay, and I now like this is like a deja vu flash. So I think similar to the Java MT sup one, like on the trigger, like persistence trigger side was designed to, like I said, like that binary, all it really does is like steal Explorer token and then like spawn as child. This one has that weird chain where I believe what happens is like the L&K is the invoked thing, which fires the executable, which then fires that giant blob of like Meterpreter crap that we saw. So like I think it's like a little bit of stealth around that in terms of like making it look kind of like, hey, if I was sitting in a SOC and I saw that process tree, or like L&K, like maybe that's like a user shortcut doing something, I don't know, like or some weird software install.
Because I think this code following those moves is creating the LNK, right?
Yeah.
And
there's the path. Yeah.
This looks familiar. I believe this is actually a very similar atomic that we have.
Yep.
Probably, yeah.
So this is interesting. So then, yeah, as you saw it over here, basically the files already existed. So then we just create the shortcut and we save the shortcut. So that wraps up step 5 for persistence. So again, you could take this PowerShell script right out of the repo, rename it to a PS1 from a TXT file, and just go test it. Obviously, you're going to need to stage some binaries if you wanted to, or you can even change them. They're right in the code to make it really easy. So you could do something like move calc somewhere else and kind of just run through and see some of this, how this works. So it's super handy to have just right there and test. So now we're on to step 6. Credential access.
This was an interesting one too, because I don't remember the exact CTI that went into this, but we thought it was interesting because in day 2 they do this really funky LSAS cred dump. In this case, I don't even think they touch LSAS. And at the time we were like, "Oh, you got creds without Mimikatz?" What? That's crazy. But again, how many creds are littered in? I think the first thing you do is pulling it from a browser or private keys and things like that. And I think that was another hallmark for us of APT29 was they understood authentication and they understood how to not only abuse you for all the creds that you didn't know you had, but also commandeer your authentication in terms of I think we were talking about this in part 1, the golden SAML stuff. They not only understood how authentication works in your environment, they understood how to provision their own creds. And actually, day 2 of the APT29 resulted in the golden ticket stuff. Where hey, they understood Kerberos probably better than a lot of admins or a lot of users, and they're basically doing kind of almost authoritative persistence based on, hey, we have this Mimikatz generated golden ticket that expires 100 years from now, so we'll be back whenever we want. We'll be DA and we'll just kind of move around and just there's nothing you can really do about it. And that was one of those gotchas where wow, that's that is. Again, those knuckles were okay, that's sophisticated. That's kind of a lot to deal with. But to your point, as a defender, there was a bunch of stuff leading up to that where they had to obviously kind of get to the domain controller, dump creds there, do a bunch of stuff over here, figure out your domain SID. So there's a lot of defensive opportunities. So ideally, I think that was kind of one of the big lessons was rather than defending golden tickets, which is pretty challenging. Hey, let's work backwards, look left, and figure out what are all the inputs, the prereqs before I can get to that point. And I think it's the same thing for ransomware. Hey, you're better off not trying to defend ransomware payloads versus they're probably RDPing in and all this crap they do to actually get to that point. All of those are those little knuckles that are probably better defensive opportunities.
Yeah, I shared a link in the chat, and then here at the bottom, I'll drop it one more time. But yeah, you mentioning that reminded me of literally an article I pulled up today from Mandiant about APT29 and going to certificate theft, and it just made me, because I was rereading this adversary plan right here too, using get private keys, stealing the PFX certificate and stuff like that. Yeah, these guys, they really do know. This is pretty deep, I'd say, and even the Mandiant blog talks about Spectre Ops's AD certificate services work that they did, right? And between APT29 and what Spectre Ops showcased about how ADCS is pretty vulnerable if you reduce the different settings and whatnot. And so it's really interesting. I agree, they're definitely very advanced on the auth side of attacks.
Yeah, and if you check out, there's that presentation. I think it's was it No Easy Breach? It's phenomenal in terms of outlining that. Even from a remediation perspective, it's figuring out how many times you have to roll over the creds and of the entire domain before those tickets are actually purged. And even now they're doing some funky stuff where they were doing even this same tradecraft and these same paradigms translate. They were doing, I believe, similar stuff in AWS. I think it was a Mandiant report not too long ago, where they were provisioning tokens for sessions, and they were hey, cool, the user, until you delete the user, these session tokens just persist. And they were able to, it's similar, it's basically a golden ticket for the cloud. And it's okay, and I think that was kind of one of our kind of Pepe Silva moments, where it's hey, they have very predictable things they like to do. Like they like to provision creds. They like to create these like golden tickets of whatever your authentication is, whether it's like a duo SID, pre-auth key or golden ticket or SAML token, whatever it is. Like that's like fascinating, but like that's actually terrifying too, because like that tells you like if you're in their aperture of like targeting, they're gonna like this wasn't a mistake. They didn't just stumble into this. Like they're gonna recreate what they think your environment is. They're probably gonna know it better than you are. So it's like one of those like again threat modeling. Like hey, like it's a hard question, but like looking around and being paranoid, like what does authentication look like in our environment, and like how do we like know like that things. I think there was a really good in response to like your tweet last week about like this talk, like that they're not already in the walls. Like it reminds me of the boy, like the little dude climbing around like watching you, like but that's like kind of how they operate. It's like really creepy.
Yeah.
That movie is probably one of the creepiest movies I've seen. Did not expect that. Won't spoil it, but definitely go check it out if you like weird plot twists and sketchiness all around.
Sequel wasn't great though, so stick with the first.
Stick with the first. Good to know.
The sequel was kind of goofed it.
Kind of back on credentials, like when I think of, okay, what potentially happened? Access check in this case, when we execute it in step 6, is actually a Chrome password dumper. So it's meant to go save credentials out of the browser. So when you save credentials, yes, they may be synced across different, you log into 5 different browsers and you sync them across, like that's where they wind up, but they're also cached locally. So the ability to dump these is what we saw initially. The other thing that I think people may not remember or forget about sometimes is credential manager. So not only web credentials based on certain like Microsoft browsers, but Windows credentials, right? You RDP into something. Hey, you want to save these? Yep, they get dropped right into here. And they all use the data protection API, which is basically a crypt, and it uses some specific information from AD to do the encryption of that data and synchronizes the master key back to AD. But there's still potential. So kind of 3 things I think of are your obviously who was logged in on the box, right? So when you think of like Mimikatz credential theft, those safe passwords, cache credentials, etc., but also what was stored in the credential manager, and then what was stored in the browser or browsers if you have multiple from that aspect. And then, of course, the last part is stealing the certificate, which we did on the last one, which is the get private keys, which was still inside of the readme.txt. It's another function. There's probably like 10 functions. This is just, we've only executed 3 out of the whole script. So
now imagine managing like all those like browser and certificate creds across like thousands of hosts. Like I sympathize with admins. I'm like, I don't know. Like securing that is just like, but again, I think it's your point, or like you kind of have to like, I don't think we're ready for this as an industry. You kind of have to be a little bit heavy handed in terms of like blocking, like, hey, like we're just going to make a lot of this stuff just not work or more difficult to abuse than just like you said, like running one binary and it's like snarfing all this stuff up.
Yeah, and then the last piece is the traditional hazard extraction. So straight out of that. So this one is a built-in function or module of Metasploit. So it's not specifically inside the PowerShell script or any of the tooling that gets uploaded during the emulation. Oh boy. Now we're back to some more collection and exfil. Let's see if we can blow up the box more.
Ruby is officially off the rails on that one. That's awesome. Yeah, I think, and this is a cool one too, because like what I thought was different between the 2 collection steps was like the first collection was very much like grab every file that might be interesting and then just like get it out of there. This one was very like attack the user behind the keyboard, like screenshots, key logging, like, and I like. At the time, I was like, oh, cool. Like, why would you do that? And then, like, you use your computer for 5 minutes. And you're like, wow, like, there's a lot of really good intel. Like, I'm typing passwords. I'm logging into internal hosts that might not be obvious. I'm sending messages. I'm kind of building out, like, almost like a human network of, like, here's the people I talk to. Here's what I talk to them about. Screenshots of, like, the stuff I'm looking at. Like, especially when you think about, like, an intelligence, like, driven operation. Like, that's probably gold for them. Especially with that, like, kind of knowledge that, like, they plan on creating a master key to this place and they're going to come back whenever they're interested. So they're kind of like, this is very much like a profiling step, which I think even now, like a lot of like ransomware actors are actually picking this up. in terms of like it makes sense to kind of know, especially if your end state is like negotiating payment, like it kind of makes sense to know who's like the actual person on the other side of the keyboard. Hello.
So, so your first part, which was screen capture, and then the other part is to do some clipboard stuff. So it's going to grab screenshots. It's going to use PowerShell to schedule jobs, use some API calls, and then grab those and then terminate it. So we, in step 7, we're getting ready to go run the Git clipboard.
Clipboard is sketchy too, right? Because we copying scripts, copying files.
Bitcoin wallets and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's also like those crazy scripts that like run that on a loop and just like regex for credit card numbers and certain like patterns that are of interest.
Yep.
So the Git clipboard did that. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say a lot of this reminds me of like the Conti leaks where like they just had like their playbook, you know, just going through this is just like, oh man, it's just like step by step, watching it happen live.
Did I miss a step? Nope. Okay. So you like bounce back at another point to go check it. So now go back to the victim machine. So we'll go back to our first one.
So also when we were executing these for like evals, it was all on like Azure. So it was super fun because we had to like network latency and you're like, imagine doing it like, you're like, oh. Yep. Okay.
And there's the output.
Nice.
I also feel bad because I know there's like some analyst somewhere who has to sit down and like get logs and logs of this and like I'm sure like
the same
do intelligence brief or like, you know,
backspacing every line.
Yeah.
Poor guy.
The last kind of few of this is just cleaning up the jobs that are still running. So they're running in the background. So that's what happens when you copy and paste. Do you think adversaries like run into like copy and paste issues?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, speaking of DFA report, there was that, I think they did like a summary a couple months ago and it was like they had OPSEC goofs where like people were typing Cobalt Strike syntax into CMD or like Linux between windows. And yeah, I think, I'd probably an interesting detection opportunity too, because I imagine that stuff's like super, in terms of like against a benign user base, it's probably super rare, like P invoke and things like that. Like I can't imagine that someone in HR is just like running that through PowerShell very often.
It kind of makes me think
my
of like
keystrokes for later.
It kind of makes me think about the like canary tokens from Thinkst, right? Like being able to trigger, you know, when someone runs K-list or NL test or something so early on. A lot of this reminds me of that too. Just kind of getting ahead of the adversary before they get too far, like into exfil.
Yeah, and even if you can't prevent it, right? There's always something to trigger, or even using things like canary tokens to do those things, right? Like who in HR is opening up PowerShell and running, setting background jobs, right? Even if you take away things like keystrokes or Git clipboard things and make it more, trying to blend in a little bit more, it's still odd, right? Unless there's, baselining is, we talk about baselining the org all the time, but it's valuable because every organization is different. You can't just show up and implement the exact same thing the exact same way at the last one because there's always that one thing that gets in the way and you got to tweak it. So that's why I think it's difficult sometimes of like, oh, just go do X, Y, and Z. And it's like, okay, great. And now I just destroyed half the org and I took it down for 6 hours and I lost a bunch of money because I just went and did X, Y, Z versus, having to figure out like, is it going to break it? But,
and you have like an inbox full of like people yelling at you, like, why doesn't my like such and such software work? And like, that's...
If you do it right, just take down email and you don't have to hear any of this because nobody can get a hold of you. And just dip off for the weekend. Do it on a Friday afternoon. But
I was gonna say, I feel like Paul's done this before.
Maybe a few times. I can't go into the details, but it may have happened or not. But
inimitable in court. Yeah,
definitely have taken down an org for a few hours before.
It was WDAC, right? You were working
on
app control.
I blocked our own IP space at the firewall.
Oh,
Ooh.
So yeah, I went to go. I flipped some numbers around, and instead of blocking the adversary, I blocked ourselves, but it also blocked the adversary, so that was kind of good. But invoke exfil. This is kind of an interesting one. So this is using WebDAV shares. So you do set up your own. In this case, it's going to go through, and very similar to the first exfil portion that we ran earlier, it's going to compress the downloads folder, add a password, as we can see.
Cryptographically safe, of course. Yeah, look at that. It's like 12 characters. Yeah.
Put it into officesupplies.7zip, and then it will actually mount this share, copy the file over, and then clean it up. So let's see if it actually completed. Yes, it did. And actually, let's go back to this one.
Yeah, there's like a cleanup function as well. I think it just like removes the files. And so I'm curious if you know, if I remember correctly, a WebDAV share is basically just like an SMB network drive, but over HTTP. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, because there's our, so not to get ahead, because that's kind of next for lateral movement, step 8. Because you actually also in the same share stage the lateral movement, which is just another binary that's going to call back to an interpreter. But there's our off supply. So it's just empty, as you can see, like timestamps, which are doing it. It's pretty close. Actually, times are off on my Windows box, but just uploads it. Adversary grabs a copy of it, and then the PowerShell script actually cleans it up. Oh, wrong box again. And so I think, we finished step 7. So step 8 is now to go into WebDAV. Yep. And then it sets up the Python. Oh, and then there's back in the interpreter shell, there is AD computer search.
I think, if I remember correctly, did you generated another Python.exe? It's like a interpreter.
Yep.
Payload?
Yeah. So
okay.
The interesting thing, again, testing was the Python interpreter itself kept crashing. So it would spin up, it'd make an initial callback, and then it'd go kaput. And that was with everything, all the security controls disabled. So I wasn't sure. So I just converted that back to a traditional HTTP based interpreter shell. But the idea is pretty much the same. It's just a different type of payload that is going to pretty much kind of give us the same results.
Okay.
Run this. AD search, again, another built-in PowerShell function within that PS version script. So 2 scripts so far. We've executed, I think at this point, 5 functions out of between those 2 scripts. Very similar.
Oh wow, this is a pretty dope environment. Yeah, you got Exchange servers and multiple.
Oh hosts.
Yeah, look at that.
And this is old. Like some of these have got actually.
You think it's a lab?
It's somebody else's environment. I just maintain access to it.
Starbucks.net. Like, oh no.
Okay.
This just turned into a pen test. Oops.
Yep. We do free pen test around here.
All right, I need to go over here. Yep. So this is the next command. So it's going to invoke a connection to sysmon 2. So we're on sysmon 1 or sysmon 0, depending on how you want to look at it. And then this is going to do some lateral movement over to our other box. We'll just copy it in because I had to set this the name. So
okay.
It calls for the IP.
If I remember correctly, this one's like basically the script is looking for an active session ID on that host. Because I think the idea was like to PS exec, you have to like find an active. Well, they were trying to find an active session and then kind of like inject it into that existing thing versus like. Actually, I don't know what happens if you PS exec into like a blank kind of unused host. Will it just kind of like run a session as system, or how does that? Actually, I have no idea what that looks like. Or will it just kind of bomb and tell you to like try again when you're more elite?
Sorry, the question was what happens when you do the WinRM session to it?
No, I'm saying I think the point of that command was like exactly as you said. Like there's I guess it'll run as session 0 because I think that's like basically run level root or system, right?
Yeah. So 0 is the services session on the desktop. We want session 1, which is the interactive user login. If you have the right permissions, you should probably be able to go to session 0. I don't know, but session 1 is the one that we want to try to.
That command really reminds me of, I think it's QW-insta or QUser. It's just more of a PowerShell way to do it.
Dropping C Daddy. There you go.
So, what a name. But so invoke cduke, and that is another function out of the PS version text file. So basically, if we go back here, it will. Where is it? I think it's at the bottom here. So you're going to give it the parameter of computer name, and then it does, again, very similar. It's going to mount the web dev that we already set up. It will then mount that. It'll grab, and then what the next command is going to do is actually use ps-exec to execute the Python out of that folder. So, I don't think I staged that. So we're going to have to hopefully make sure this works. So that should be all set up soon.
I think that, yeah, that's where you need that session ID. I think it's what?
Yep.
IP address, domain user, password, which I'm assuming the password's coming from the cred dump earlier. And then
yes. So I need to do.
That was also like a fun thing about building out these plans was like once you built kind of the flow, you had to like go back and make sure like, okay, like I shouldn't be able to run that command unless I have like creds and like, so it's, I think that was one of the big things we were trying to aim for too, is like realism, where you can't act on information you don't have. So like you had to discover stuff, you had to like actually collect creds, you had to have like, you know, all these like things actually staged, but also like it was always fun injecting like the, like I guess the false positive discovery where like, you know, they're not just going to run like very surgical discover the things they want and then only do that. There's going to be some loud, like, you know, not necessarily scanning every IP in the net block, but like that kind of stuff where it's like, maybe they didn't actually use that, or they found some stuff that wasn't interesting. But I think that was one of those like limitations things where it's like, hey, like in a perfect world, we probably like move laterally to every host in the environment, but realistically, we're going to maybe just like do that, like cut corners a little bit just for the simulation of site adversary.
And I don't remember what I set up the interpreter payload as, so we'll just run another handler and see what happens. So this should work.
Good luck, everybody. Let's see.
Okay.
Looks good. I love the not password. Let's see.
That's the password to all my lab stuff. So if you ever break into my lab, every credential you ever need is just not password, exactly like that. So just find the users and have fun. Good luck.
I think
there's a lot of stuff in there.
I think I remember this one. So there might be, sometimes there's like a pop-up on the actual host desktop where you have to like, I'm just curious if that happened here. Oh, never mind.
There it is.
Yeah, okay.
I win.
Well done.
Yay.
Well done.
All
Did
right.
it live.
Live.
Like 1 out of every 10. There's
more
like a little,
collection.
like, yeah.
I know.
Well,
How
they're an
much stuff do
intelligence.
they need to steal at this point? They have everything.
Intelligence for the win. Wait, what are they doing here? Oh, it's the same smash and grab as earlier,
Okay.
effectively.
All right,
Oh, and then they roar it, and then you're gonna get to do some more S-delete. So that's exciting. And ironically, you get to del S-delete. So that's a little like a bit of a recursive nod.
Okay. Some of this looks the same. Actually, I don't think I have raw. Let's find out.
Yeah, where is roar? Oh yeah. Okay.
So be upload.
Back home on the C2.
No, I don't have RAR. But because I'm in the wrong folder. cduke. Okay, and then we want to go into ctemp. There it is.
Paul, was that I think you had ran the accept EULA. Yeah, it's actually in there. So it's interesting. I was kind of curious. Earlier we were using the / on the accept EULA, and then the second one for the ps-exec is using the hyphen. I always think about that from like a detection engineering standpoint, right? Like folks going after just one or the other. And yeah, that's pretty cool.
I think if I remember correctly, like there's some syntax, at least I know in like Sigma, where it kind of like it almost like wildcard but bounded to like you said slash. But there's also like the interesting thing we saw is like sometimes you can use like flags, like single letters. Sometimes you can like spell out like half the word, and it'll like, oh, I know what you meant. Like,
Yep.
so there's some strange little obfuscation tricks there.
I think it was with Run DLO 32. It only looks for like the S for silent, and anything else you put beyond it, you can put anything, but because it literally only looks for the the hyphen or the /S.
Yeah, that's
kind of cool.
Now you're like triggering something that reminded me. Like Run DL32's like acceptance of flags, like it'll take ordinals, and like there's like some little like weird trick with like Unicode encoding where like it'll bounce, but like the way it like the search order, it'll like check it. There's some like weird. Wait, what's the oddity here? Now I want to get this right.
Oh my gosh. We have some of the other ones in an atomic test harness as well. Where we use a different type of hyphens and pipe or whatever they are. It's like really weird.
I'm going to read this straight from Attack. As part of Windows compatibility support for various character sets, Run DL32 will first check for wide Unicode characters before loading like special. So it'll like if you run like Run DL32 evil.dll like main, it'll check for main W and then main A and then main. So like I think the idea was like if you build a malicious DLL, like you could really just hide like the malicious stuff in like one function. And then like if reverse engineers going through all these functions, they're all like legitimate, and there's just like one tiny one that's like the crud. Again, not fail proof, but like annoying enough to be like, why not?
Yep.
Where we at?
Oh yeah. Where we? I was looking at test harnesses now.
Oh, is this the actual exfil on your server?
Yeah, so you can see there's the file. So in kind of last step, we are at 9.
I think C. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, so we just finished up 9B, which was so we uploaded RAR and sdelete. We zipped up again, went through, grabbed a whole bunch of stuff. This box doesn't have a whole bunch of stuff, so it actually zipped up things pretty quickly. And then we download it. We actually compress it using RAR and then download it. So now we're on 9C, which is to go into sdelete. And in this case, we're not going to go back into interactive PowerShell. We're going to go straight into just a standard command terminal prompt. So we'll run these, and holy crap, look at the time.
Yes, completely unrelated though. I did share. I'll drop it into the chat too. But the different ones: hyphen, n dash, m dash, horizontal bar, and / on those.
So,
oh my god.
One trademark of like most evals plans is like step 10 or step 20. Like the last step of every plan is always like literally just fire the persistent. So I think in this case, all you have to do is like wait. So it's a service and a run key. So you might just need you're doing a full reboot. So
yeah, I was gonna say it says reboot to trigger it all. And then log in. Reboot and log in.
Attention. Okay, so because I didn't replace the username,
nice.
need to just delete the working zip off of roaming and the working zip out of desktop. So now we're going to actually just run the delete command against sdelete. Because
well done. That'd be one of those like detection opportunities of like, like that's sitting in a sock and you see that process spawn. Like, that's not. It's Conti playbook-esque.
Yeah. Yes. I have a gist of that somewhere. I gotta find it.
Shout out to whoever translated that too, because it's huge.
I think somebody piped it straight through Google Translate, used like $30 to just feed it straight through and call it a day. And yeah, that's it. And then just leave. The next step is 10 is persistence. So that basically would just validate the Java service that we created back in step 5 or 6 when we ran the invoke persistence 1. So it would basically just validate, like, keep your handler running, go reboot the box. These boxes would take a minute to come back up, so I don't want to burn time just waiting. But Because we set automatic startup, when the box comes back up, that's the persistence in case that box does get bounced in the middle of it, or nightly reboots or what have you. It just ensures that comes back online. So if they did everything right, they didn't have any copy paste fails, then it should just work if that box bounces and comes back and Metasploit's running. But that's it. That's scenario one. Again, very smash and grab, a ton of opportunity for this to go in, and of course, plenty of opportunity to automate this whole thing. Using Caldera or a Prelude, get those set up and staged, and just let them fly.
Very, 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 very.
I do dig the. I think kind of go back to that purple team piece of, even if like you're going step by step, like you can like, just like what we were doing, execute a piece, go and validate there's detection coverage, execute another piece, kind of just go down the line. Like there's a lot of value.
Yeah.
Tabletop half of it and say, I don't care. I just want to see steps 1, 5, and 10. Good. Yeah.
And we were talking in the Atomic maintainers meeting yesterday, which was interesting tool that one of the maintainers wrote, was to figure out when I run a test, like how do I make sure like the test I ran, I can have some form of identification, like here's the GUID to the associated test, versus, because I think sometimes that's why I run 5 tests. Like, okay, some of those may show up at different times from a logging standpoint. Like, how do I ensure like I can associate that test to that particular data set or expectation and timing? And it's kind of an interesting conundrum, and her perspective of how they do it is really interesting. So I think there could be something similar to this, of using GUIDs before and after to do like, okay, here's the start of it, here's the end of it, and then find the GUIDs and timestamps in between to try and validate like the data is expected.
We were talking about like security recordings in the first iteration. I think that, to me, that's like the future, like purple teaming. Exactly, you said, like, hey, like here's the red side, run it. Everything gets recorded, and then like you get like an output of like in a box, like here's your emulation, here's your data, like modularize it, go. Like that's obviously a lot harder to implement, especially if you think about like cloud and like multi-platform nuanced stuff. But I think that would be like really slick, especially if we kind of build these like test little universes where it's like, you want to see cred dumping, like there's your like cred dump, throw whatever defensive stuff you went in there, but like there's just cred dumping flying all over the place, like go nuts, the Thunderdome of LSAS memory manipulation.
Well, welcome to the party, pal. Die hard.
Yes.
This is cool. I think there's a lot of opportunity for this, and figuring out how to even break it down into smaller sections and do like a real targeted validation. Because I think some orgs, there's definitely value for orgs to do it. I think it's also finding the time and the resources to make sure that you can effectively do this and kind of just run it. But even some of those, just download the binaries right from the resources repo and just put them on a desktop of a test VM and just copy and paste the commands. Even if you don't do callbacks, right? Just the value of doing it. It's kind of like what Atomic Red Team does. Is like very simple, like go test and validate that the telemetry you expect out of that test actually exists, and then validating like from there.
C2 optional. Yeah. And I think that's that kind of like, and I like that too, because it's like we're shifting the problem towards, like before it was like people don't have a menu, like, but now like you have a menu to choose from. The problem really, like you said before, is like the intrinsic, like, what do I actually care about? And it's like, I think that's a good problem to have. It's like, hey, like I'd rather the struggle being educating folks to figure out like where the priorities are, and then they can kind of like find what they need, versus like the inverse of like, I don't know what I need, and I also don't have the means of doing it unless I create it. And so I think like, collectively, everything we're talking about, like whether it's full emulation plans, atomic, micro, whatever else people are doing, like we're really building this like corpus of like basically tools. And it's like, okay, cool. Like I can't build a house, but if you give me a hammer and like a nail, like I could at least like build something that might crash and fall, but at least it's better than like nothing.
I think that's an important aspect. It's like the getting started is hard, right? Like, okay, somebody built the menu for us, but now what do I pick? Like, what do I go do? And I think little things to even just, if it works and it made you better, like that's a win. Doesn't have to be the best, but if it moved the needle, even the slightest, like that's a win. Like you go to detect S-delete based activity now, like congrats, like that's a win. Is it a full win? Yeah, but it's a starting point, and I think it's imperative for like people to think about is like, cool, here's an entire plan. Like, no, you don't need to go do the entire thing and detect all of it. Like, that's not the objective, right? It's not might or bingo of I have full coverage of the map. Like, it's target things that are going to matter and give you that upper hand. So
I think to your point, like even if you go to the most like sophisticated orgs, like, everyone's like, oh, like they got all their defenses, everything's, going well. And you ask them like, are you done? And you're like, no, like we know I think the difference is like they've been doing edit for a while and like they are at least like aware of like, we're not playing might or bingo, but they can at least point like that whole tactic, this stuff, we have nothing. But like that awareness of like knowing where you are is like, I don't know how to get there besides exactly you said. Like you start with like one, you figure out where you are, and you move on to the next one. Also, I got to ask, Mike, that's awesome. Is that a detection lab shirt?
It is, yeah. It's old
What?
school. Yep. I know, it's my shout out to Chris Long.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yep. A while back, he put this up for sale on the Twitters.
Oh, I was gonna say, is it still on Etsy or something? That's awesome.
Yeah, it was probably one print. I was just gonna say another really cool hunt was sysinternals in general. I remember we had 70,000 endpoints across my last org and one of my last orgs, and half the time people don't even know that they had sysinternals running in their environments. Even if it's just like the little background thing, putting computer name on the desktop and stuff, but yeah, like PS-exec and Procmon and just random tools running out there. There's even just those things are good quick wins to just understand that attack surface and what's out there. And yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, there's like, I think people always like, you think sysinternals and you're like, oh, it's all like defensive or admin tools. Like PS-exec is not a weapon, but like can be weaponized. And like, wait, there's probably a couple others that are like have some funky dual purpose. Estelite, another one, like not necessarily malicious in sense, but like operational in a sense, or can be kind of converted to the dark side, Anakin style.
What is it? Procmon had the driver that's vulnerable.
Proc dump. Proc dump with LSAS dumps. Yeah.
Yep. And then
process hacker too. Not in the same camp, but similar tool, and it has the vulnerable driver that can be leveraged. I think it was also the other one. It's hacker, process explorer. One of them. There's definitely the two process.
Yeah. You can map the live.sysinternal site. You can map it as a network drive or a share.
I mean, that alone is wild. I'm surprised I haven't run across that yet, because it's basically a web dev that you can just then mount. So like, instead of bringing it, just mount the map and then call execution off of that. Like you can tweak this, and instead of mounting your internal web dev server, like go mount the one right from sysinternals. I think it's just
that might be an atomic.
I feel like if it's not, we should go create one real quick and just ship it up. Or if somebody wants a free T-shirt, awesome. First time submitting an atomic, you get a shirt. So go submit it. We'll help you write it.
Speaking of T-shirts, Jamie, you will be getting a first edition of an El Camino.
What? That's awesome.
So, we'll have to get that
looking forward to it. I will wear it with pride. You're going to see it like a TACCon or something and be on stage, open a jacket.
You're like, what's that?
El Camino security testing. No, it's been super fun. I unfortunately have to drop, but I'm glad we finally got to run through this and chat more, because I think this is an interesting perspective and kind of phase of where do you go from running atomics to kind of trying to figure out how to emulate certain threat actors, and having the menu that you mentioned earlier, the cookbook of like, here are the plans, like go test them, and the ability to do that, and even simplistically and with tools like Caldera to import them and make it a little bit easier for people to use, so you don't have to worry about trying to build all your own stuff. It's super valuable.
I can't think of a better way to spend a Friday afternoon. So thanks for having me. Too much fun. Looking forward to following up with different episodes. I'm kind of curious where you guys take this going forward. So thanks.
Got a lot of cool stuff planned for the next few months, and looking forward to getting you back on it soon as well. It's been awesome, especially your perspectives of where you're at and where everybody's heading with this. So thank you for taking the time to jump on the second time and just hang out and chat with us.
Pleasure was all mine.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Appreciate it.
Thanks all. We'll catch you next time.
Have a good day. See ya.
Doodles.